Woohoo! Super impromptu video that I just kinda did and didn't script at all, so I'm gonna say a lot of ums and uhs, and there's gonna be a lot of blank space where I have to pause and gather my thoughts. You have been warned. Okay, so I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the demo for God Eater 3 that just came out, like, yesterday on PSN, and I went to try it out and figured I'd share some impressions and thoughts and just general things, but like, God Eater's a bit of a weird franchise, and a surprising amount of people probably haven't either heard of it or ever even bothered to play it. So it's something to discuss and explain real quick, because otherwise you might be a little confused on what I'm getting at. So God Eater in general is this like RPG series that just takes place in a post-apocalyptic world with these strange alien monster thingies. I'm not sure if they're supposed to be aliens or mutants or demons from actual hell, because really I could never follow the plot of these games when I tried to play any of them in the past. But your job is basically just to go and hunt these things with weapons made slightly from their own power and slightly from some other weird technology. God Eater's a strange series that I don't think you would ever have fun making sense of the story with, but the story is really not the focus of the game. In fact, it's much more about the multiplayer and the killing monsters, and that's really what you're doing. It's just a big hack and slash. You just run around and beat the ever-loving crap out of monsters and make parts from their things. If you played Monster Hunter, this is sounding familiar already, isn't it? It's basically just a knockoff Monster Hunter game, and it's all real good and genuinely enjoyable, but I haven't liked the previous God Eater games nearly as much as this one. In fact, outright, I will tell you this God Eater game is the only one that I honest to God recommend already if it's going to be completely like this, because this is the only one that's fun. And I don't mean that to sound mean, because I don't really, it's not that I think the other ones are bad, it's that I think that they have a lot of work that needed to be done on them in a lot of ways. That I've tried to play them on the PS4, and the PS4 versions of these games very much feel like very watered down ports of PlayStation Portable games. Not the Vita, portable, the old PSP. And it feels awful. It feels like torture to try and play some of those. I don't really recommend going back to them unless you're already super interested in them in the first place, you know? Like if you actually did like what you've played of them in the past at all. But this game is on a whole nother level. God Eater 3, honest to God, feels like the big difference between Monster Hunter World and freaking every previous Monster Hunter before that. It feels so much smoother to the control, and there are new weapons here that genuinely make things better. And they're fun to use. Though maybe comparing to Monster Hunter World isn't quite the right spot, because that would say that this game doesn't still have some of the rough edges that the rough edges that made God Eater 1 and 2 what they are in some ways, where sometimes the controls still feel like they were made for a Vita. Like, you don't do a whole lot with the lower triggers. You're mostly doing things with L1 and R1, and the bottom triggers are used exclusively to trigger a new mechanic, a link kind of mechanic you do with your partners. It's a little strange, but like, there's things like that, or that the gun mode is not actually aimed with the right stick. Like, you can set it up to let you aim with the right stick to a degree, and that does change some things, but it's not really made for you to do it that way, and you're still firing with the square and triangle buttons instead of using the lower triggers at all to fire a gun. And it seems really weird, but luckily the guns are almost entirely optional from what I understand, because I never really found a moment that I absolutely needed to use them in the demo. But I also don't know if that's just because it's a demo and they just didn't have the moments where you would need the gun, or if that's a bigger thing further down the road. Either way, it's something to keep your eyes on and to know about, that the guns don't control like a regular shooter. They control kind of like it was made to only be played with one analog stick when you use them, and to not be able to do things with the proper, or with the triggers to shoot. And it feels like that. But overall, it still controls well. In fact, that's the big thing to take away from God Eater 3's demo at all is that the controls have been improved drastically. I said earlier that it felt like playing a PSP game, and I really mean that. The older games used to feel like you were still on a PSP even when you had a better controller. It had the psychological feeling of making it feel like a lesser game just because the controller was just not up to snuff with what you were doing with it. Like, the game was not rebuilt around PS4 controls. Here you can tell that the game has been built around the PS4 controller and that it's actually made for the right thing, but it's still not perfect. It still does feel like the early development of this game was made for a Vita, and they changed their minds somewhere along the line. Or that they kept the controls the way they are to be sort of a tribute to older God Eater games, rather than, like, outright changing and fixing everything a la Monster Hunter World. In that sense, I guess it's a little closer to maybe the Switch release of Monster Hunter Generations than it is to the PS4 Monster Hunter World. You know, it's not a dramatic fix when it comes to the controls, but it's still a huge step in the right direction. It's still improvements, and a lot of them. The game feels a lot better, and as a result, it's become a lot more accessible control-wise, which is really good. And there's also new weapons and stuff to try out. There's only 2 that I noticed, but there might be more in the final game. I don't know about that. I'm going to lean on no. But the 2 that are here, the new ones, are really nice. Prior to this, there were like 3 different types of swords, like a short sword, a long sword, and a great sword. And like there was a spear, a scythe, a hammer, and I think that was it. This game introduces dual blades, which will be your default weapon, and this giant circular blade boomerang thing, a crescent moon blade or whatever. It's a real interesting weapon. I like that one too, but I definitely stuck to those dual blades. The dual blades are a ton of fun to use. Like, I was sitting there just mashing around with them, having fun. And they don't feel like dual blades in a lot of other games, but that's because they're also a little bit more technical. To compare to Monster Hunter and just keep that going, for those of you more familiar with those, they control more like or their gimmick is a little bit closer to a charge blade. You actually have 2 different states with the dual blades. You either have the regular form, just dual blades swishing around, or you have a mixed, like a linked form of them, where you like take them and just connect them together and make a double-ended spear, and you start like slashing around with that instead. And that's really interesting, and it was real fun to use. It stops you from regenerating stamina, though, at the cost of doing more damage per hit. So it's something you actually have to learn to juggle around with, giving that weapon essentially a third form to switch to. Your blades, your spear, and the gun. And it's just genuinely fun to use that way. I had a lot of fun with that weapon in particular, and I thought that was a huge improvement. The Crescent Moon is interesting too, though there are a couple of weird things about the control in general still that don't sit right with me. I already mentioned the guns thing and how that should really be something you can shoot with your triggers, or have settings to shoot with the triggers, and you just don't. But the controls in general feel better, but the button mappings are still weird. Like, for example, your circle button is your guard, and it can only be your guard, and your R1 is your dodge, and it can only be your dodge. And to me, I would much rather switch those around. And in the settings, you can change some things around to do that a little bit, but really what you end up doing is either one of these is still your dodge or still your shield, but now you have to hold down both buttons at once to do one of the actions, or you can set them to both be like on their own. So it's either you have to hit R1 and circle to dodge, or R1 and circle to block, or you have to hit them both on their own the way I had it set up, which was Type C. And that was the only way that I found myself enjoying the controls for that part, but it bothers me because the whole game's button mappings should be set up to where we can customize them fully, and it bugged me in God Eater 2, and it bugs me just as much here that I still can't just fully lay out my buttons however I want, So that's a thing that bothers me. And I wish that was a fixed thing already, but I guess we'll have to wait until they inevitably hit the point Monster Hunter does, where they're like, okay, we need to make a game with a perfect control setup so people who weren't into this before might actually like it. You know? But until we get to that point, we're stuck with that. That said, I did adapt to those weird button mappings rather quickly, and after doing so, I started to see that there's a surprising amount of depth to this game in a lot of little places. There's things like you have burst arts, is what they call them, but unlike a lot of other games where they're either like mapped to buttons or a special move kind of thing, burst arts are really combo finishers, essentially, that just happen at the end of whatever your moves are when you're in what the game considers burst mode, which you might see me going into on the screen in the little B-roll footage I just recorded here, where it's just, it is a mode you go into after devouring a bit of the monster that you're fighting with your weapon, and it's rather interesting to go into because you need to be keeping that meter up a lot in order to be doing the most damage. When you're in burst mode, all your attacks do more damage, and that's real helpful. And going into burst starts a little better, it took me a while to figure out and understand them, but what burst starts do and how they work is just they're combo finishers that you can change up and have different effects, and they're real effective when you know what to do with them. But I still don't understand much about how these things really work. Like, no matter how much I was trying to read the tutorial and understand what these were, it took me until I looked it up to understand what some of these are, and I still don't know how to do one of them, because you have 3 types. It was ground, jump, and step. And I can't figure out what step means. I thought it meant, doing your dodge and like dodging into an attack, but doing a dodge into attack doesn't do anything. And it's not the weird attack that's mapped to the right D-pad button instead of being, on R2 or something like it could have been and should have been. Things like that. It's a lot of little design choices I don't understand, but please don't take that to have me sound like I'm really negative on the game, because I'm really not. It's mostly that this is the 3rd game in the series, and there's a lot of little things like that that just haven't been fixed yet, things that I feel should have been changed by the 2nd game that they didn't change by the 3rd game. And this bothers me in the same way that not being able to shoot diagonally would have bothered a Metroid fan if they hadn't done it in Super Metroid. Where it's a very clear innovation that should totally be there, and we still can't do it by that point. Granted, in Super Metroid you can, but it's just an example, if you follow. Either way, I still really enjoyed the demo, and this is the thing, that as negative as I sound on a lot of aspects, this demo has convinced me to pick up God Eater 3 when I initially didn't think I was going to bother. Like when I was going to have to be dragged into playing God Eater 3 by a friend or something before. Now I look at it and think, fuck man, I'll play this. This sounds like a good time. I was going into rooms with random people and just hanging out and fighting monsters with them, and it was interesting. It was fun to try and do. But for all the really good stuff going on with the game, it's so good. There's one thing that confused the hell out of me, and that is there's 2 types of missions. There's the regular missions you can take on, and there's one they call assault missions. And all I really got out of this was that it sends you into an 8-player room to fight a monster, right? And that makes a little bit of sense considering before you could only go with 4 people. But now, for some reason, the monster has a 5-minute timer, and I don't understand if you're supposed to be able to kill the monster or not, or if it's just a timer that's just there and you're supposed to fight for as long as you can, and once you've made enough progress, whatever progress you made in that 5 minutes, you get to keep rewards from it. I don't understand for sure if it works that one way or the other, and I really wish that they did something to be a little bit more clear about that, but there is no in-game explanation I found on assault missions, and all my Googling was for naught. Nobody could tell me stuff at all. In fact, the only news about God Eater 3 I was finding was that there's a demo that exists, and that's just great. But honestly, I had fun with this game. I would totally recommend it to you already if the demo is a good indicator of the full game. Keep that disclaimer in mind. It comes out on February 8th, and I really do look forward to trying it out and picking this up and seeing how things go. And, if anybody out there would like to join me when I do and spend some time kicking some monster butt, let me know. I would love to just have some fun. So, anyhow, this has been Silhouette signing off. You guys have a good night.